Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Empower LEP podcast. I'm your host, Jana Parker, licensed educational psychologist, group practice owner, and mentor at Empower LEP. Today, I host Scott Robson, a business coach for wholehearted entrepreneurs. Listen in to hear about Scott's journey as an entrepreneur himself, how he developed the Adaptotype and the Adaptotype quiz so that we could learn about how we deal with pressure and overwhelm, and learn a little bit about his ideals and his coaching style. I really appreciate Scott's approach to supporting people through the entrepreneurial journey. I'm really thankful that he came onto the podcast to share it with us. As always, I hope that you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Welcome, Scott Robson, to the Empower LEP podcast. How are you today?
I'm so good. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no, you're welcome. I heard you on the Testing Psychologist podcast, and I immediately went to your website and took your Adaptotype test. And, a school psychologist loves a good assessment, and especially something that has to do with like personality and style of being. And so I found it really interesting. And then I just, thought that you would be, after we've chatted a little bit, a great person to have on the show. So thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me on. I'm really excited.
Yeah. So this podcast is all about kind of like, what else can you do with this life that we have like a foundation in educational psychology, and we have this love and passion for what we do. And most of us, if not all of us, start out working in a really stable, consistent system, i.e. the school districts. And, at some point, as we evolve through our career, we find ourselves potentially thinking about using what we have in other ways. And whether that means we do it kind of on the side or just kind of explore different things while we still have our school district job, a lot of us are kind of venturing into different kinds of things. And so this podcast is really about that process of starting in a stable place and then kind of realizing that maybe we want a little bit more or something a little bit different. And I really wanted to have you on because you are, number one, an entrepreneur yourself, and number two, somebody who helps people through this process.
That's right. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so for the listeners, Scott is not part of our field, yet you kind of are. I would say you're kind of part of our field in the psychology realm as a coach. But Scott is a coach, and I want to start by asking you a little bit about your own journey. And I want to start with your tagline in your signature. It says, "Hi, I'm Scott Robson. I'm a double certified coach specializing in coaching mindful, wholehearted entrepreneurs on their journey to develop aligned confidence, self-belief, and sustainable momentum." I just totally love this. I want to know how this evolved. And, so take us through a little bit of your journey into how you evolved into what you do today.
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah. So I started off, I'm an art school kid originally. So I went to art school for university, and I ended up going to publishing very soon after that. And I worked in the publishing industry for about almost 20 years. And I ran was essentially an in-house agency for a couple of different publishers. And the last one I was there for 12 years. We worked on probably about 15 different magazines. And I loved it because I do love design and I still love design. But it turns out the magazine industry is not an industry that is growing in over 50 states.
Yeah,
So I was always ended up being like the last man standing, after like the newest round of layoffs. But I love the work that I was doing because I was connecting with actually a lot of entrepreneurs, because we were not only inward facing, we would do a lot of the marketing for the company, but we were also very outward facing. We worked with a lot of the advertisers, not just these luxury international brands, which constituted like about maybe 50% of each of the issues, but also the small local brands. And so we were a city specific publications that we had. And I was working alongside all of these local moms and pops in all of these cities across the US. And they were making big investments to have like these little quarter page, half page ads
Yeah.
in the magazine. And this constituted for them a huge investment, of course,
Right.
of their annual revenue. And I was just always so struck by the passion that they had, that each of them had a vision. Each of them was so incredibly dedicated to that vision. And for them, this is just an expression of that. And so I really wanted to work with entrepreneurs after I left that field, after I sort of realized, you know what, turns out maybe this is not going to be the place where I'm going to go get old and retire from, just because magazines are going in a different direction.
Mm.
So I ended up going back into something that I had started almost 20 years before, which was my coaching training. I had gotten my initial coaching training almost immediately after graduating from college. And this is before there was really, an ICF, an International Coaching Federation, which is the sort of global governing body of coaching. And it was a lot looser back then, even more than today, which is still fairly loose, to be honest. And they they really trained me in a lot of fantastic tools that I loved using throughout my career.
Mm.
But I realized that, when I looked back and was thinking like, what can I do that actually makes an impact, that actually felt really connected to while I was doing it? It was pretty obvious what that was going to be. And I was going to be going back into coaching. So I
Mm.
went back, I got my certification, I opened up my practice. I've been doing this for over 10 years now. And I sort of off ramped myself into the practice as my previous career was coming to a close. And the writing was on the wall because we had gotten bought by our like competitor.
Okay.
And then I sort of have been doing it ever since. And so working with entrepreneurs for me was an obvious thing because I just really loved that experience and I wanted to continue to support them in doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, how was, um, what kinds of, I don't know, like what kinds of challenges do you remember facing as you made that shift into working for someone else to working for yourself?
Yeah, massive, massive amounts of self-doubt. I don't know if anybody else is familiar with what that feels like. Which is funny because that's almost exclusively one of the big things that I coach around is self-doubt as an entrepreneur, really, and building self-belief out of your self-doubt.
Mhm.
But it was really just, it felt sort of directionless, but in a very liberating way, to be honest, because I knew that I can go in any direction. I knew vaguely I wanted to work with entrepreneurs. I wasn't quite sure what that was going to look like, but I had a lot of things that were holding me back at the time that it was just not on the table. Things like doing group programs, being on video, really putting myself out there, marketing myself in a very, front forward sort of way. All these things that frankly, now I look back and I think, well, if you want to have a successful business, those are all things that you probably should do. But it was really me pushing up against a lot of my growth edges, which I think is true for a lot of entrepreneurs when they go out on their own. It ends
Mhm.
up being this really great sort of tableau for, okay, where do you actually feel that you're allowed to take up space? What do like, what is your belief around what you think the world is allowing you to have, right? And that comes out in your business. So your business ends up being a really great place for you to get a real good snapshot of where you're sort of growing into and where maybe you're limiting yourself. And that was so true for me at that time as well. And it took years to figure that out, really. And I was lucky enough to be able to have some great anchor clients sort of pulling me through those years. But it was definitely it was a learning experience. And so for me, it's like working with this community now, I so get it because I've
Mhm.
been there. It's the work that I personally have done. And I don't think you ever get rid of self-doubt. I don't think you ever lose it. This is part of the human condition. But I think you learn to work with it, and I think you learn to heal it and to have a relationship with it where it's no longer in the driver's seat.
Mhm. Yeah, and this mission statement is kind of something that I think we all really have to think about as we're developing our business. And I feel like also it may change over time.
Yeah.
But it's one of the things that I'm helping coach people through, or like just not even that I don't even really know how to do this so well, but I think it's very important for people to go through this process of having a a really solid understanding of what their mission is, even if it changes over time. So how did how did you choose these words? How did you go through this process to, um, because I think you put a lot of time into all of the words that are in this sentence
Yeah,
about
thanks.
yourself.
That's so nice that you're reflecting that back to me too, because it's like you write these things and you rewrite them probably a dozen times until you finally land on the thing, right?
Yeah,
Um, if this reflects a journey in and of itself, I think, of my practice, getting to this place where I'm talking about having aligned confidence, self-belief, and sustained momentum, and working with wholehearted entrepreneurs. I think for me, and I won't generalize, but I think that I think that I'll just talk about the coaching space because
sure.
that's my space. Um, I think that there's a pressure to be a little bit of a performance coach. And I think that as entrepreneurs, there's a little bit of a pressure for us to be always performing as well. And so there's this really symbiotic relationship that I don't think is necessarily very healthy when it comes to this, because I think actually that sort of like focus on performance only actually doesn't do much other than give us short-term gains and actually really aggravates our self-doubt. Because what happens after you sort of, go through that initial push, that initial burst of energy, you sort of fall off the wagon a little bit, right? Your old habits come back, or maybe it's just you're not feeling great one day and you're sort of, you're like a little under the weather, or maybe you had a couple glasses of too much of wine the night before.
Mm-hmm.
All of these things will sort of that natural human moment will come back in and suddenly you're not operating so great. And then where are you? Who
Yeah.
are you? It all comes flooding back. And so me, this idea of moving past performance only, not only just coaching, but like thinking about entrepreneurship in a different way, where it's much more about going back to what I was saying before, like everything's going to come up for you as an entrepreneur
Mm-hmm.
anyway, right?
Yeah.
We can't silo this concept of entrepreneurship into a persona. Like your inner 5-year-old or inner 10-year-old is going to be along for the ride too, right? And so let's just talk about it.
Yeah.
Let's just integrate that, right? And so that's when we talk about being a wholehearted entrepreneur,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where you're actually able to talk about these things. Like, yeah, it turns out this experience actually is having a really big impact on, let's say, my ability to have challenging conversations or to set boundaries with my clients,
Yeah.
right? So that's really where that came from. Having aligned confidence, meaning that you sort of belong to yourself, right? That's the confidence that you have really generated from your own values. Having self-belief, right? Which is sort of knowing the space that you take up and then set that sustainable momentum where you're not just performing, like I said, for the sake of performing. It's like, wait, actually, like, what does the shape of this business look like that it actually fits me? Do I need to be making $3 million a year? Most of us probably not. And they think that's okay. We can sort of define what that looks like for us. But if you want to have that, great. How can we get that? But I think for most of us, it's like, how can we make this momentum actually sustainable for us so we can right size it for our lives? And I think that that's an important idea when it comes to what relationship do you want to have with your business.
Yeah. This is so different than I mean, I've spoken with so many different kinds of business coaches, and this I feel like really resonates for me. And I think will a lot for even just the community and this audience because we are so psychologically minded. Um, and I think it could potentially be a little easier to get in touch with that or just at least think about it in a way that yeah, this just really resonates. So thank you. And I think so. Talk a little bit about the adaptotype because that has potentially come out of your work and seeing all of this in other people, I think is what I remember you saying. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks. I This was a journey for sure. I think, one of the things that I love to do is find patterns and things. It's just
Hmm.
something, it's just like everybody in my family is an engineer. I'm like one of the only ones that isn't. It obviously like seeped in at the edges somewhat, right?
Yeah.
So for me, where it really started was with this idea about, you know, how is our desire for comfort and avoidance of discomfort and overwhelm ruling our lives and our relationships and our goals, right? And for me, it was really interesting to think of this in terms of like, is comfort a basic need that we have, right? And how does discomfort, when it comes to feeling overwhelmed, really inform the stories that we create about, you know, what we think we can do and what we think, you know, we're allowed to have in this world? And so I started looking at the all of my clients through the lens of this, like, how are they in relationship to discomfort, to overwhelm? And I looked at it also through the lens of some other things like goal orientation theory, and you know, some other areas that I've studied. And for me, it very clearly sketched a bit of a pattern when it came to this, right? Um, I found a lot of my clients, you know, they were either overworking, right, to try to sort of outpace the self-doubt, or they were underworking to try to keep the self-doubt at bay, right? Or they felt like they were always missing out on an opportunity and they had a million ideas, but at the same time, they couldn't choose any of them,
Mm.
right? It was like another idea every single time I talked to them. And I'm like, oh, interesting, right? We're not actually moving forward. It's just always another idea.
Yeah.
Um, I have a lot of those clients who were incredibly, actually very, they were very at peace in overwhelm, which is interesting. They could actually shoulder quite a lot, but then it became, well, when does it hit? And it turns out it's like when they sort of reach that tipping point, when that overwhelm becomes a little bit too much, they have a little bit too much on the plate, and then the crush of feelings becomes intense. And so I was able to sort of really sort of sketch these all out based on these different personal experiences, professional experiences, and a few different other systems that I was looking at. And it's just sort of crystallized for me. And I brought it out and I started testing it and beta testing it, and people really responded to it. I shared it with colleagues and friends, and they're like, yeah, this is really vibing for me. I added a couple, I deleted a couple, I combined a few, and it slowly started to come together where what we're describing here is essentially like create like how can we create awareness around what your adaptive style is around overwhelm, right?
Hmm.
How do we adapt to overwhelm in our lives, and how we can see it as a normal, healthy construct. Um, each of the different styles, there's 6 different styles of adaptive types that explain your sort of style around coping with overwhelm. Each has their own limitations and their own gifts, right? So we can sort of see, like, for example, like, you know, how we're sort of avoiding overwhelm, but then also like how do we build skills in that overwhelm that actually we can start to lean into,
Hmm.
right? But those limitations and drawbacks of those styles, it's like how can we start to grow past them so we can keep the gifts of it and actually expand past whatever the limitations are of it. And that's the hope of the adaptive type quiz, is that people can start to really get that sense of self-awareness around, you know what, this is how I'm operating not only in overwhelm, but in some places when I'm actually not overwhelmed, but historically I have been, right? So like that's going to be like Thanksgiving dinner, you know, like you're having a great day. Why am I overwhelmed right now? Everything's fine, right? But it's sort of coming up, or you know, maybe at work or in other circumstances, or with certain family members that you historically have some conflict with, right? It's like we sort
Hmm.
of lean into these styles to help keep us safe psychologically.
Yeah.
Um, so it's just sort of becoming aware of some of the limitations and learning, you know, how can we grow past them. It just gives us some new options for learning to grow.
Yeah, yeah. I remember when I first took the test, I got my results and I was like, I'm not really sure. Like, I'm not really sure how these things like resonate. Some things kind of resonated, others were kind of like, I was like, hmm. But now that I've talked with you a few times and I went back and looked at it, I'm all, oh, maybe because you were like, oh, you for sure are the a strategist. And I'm like, am I though? And I'm thinking maybe I am, But yeah, I mean, and what was interesting with you is like when we did first work together, it's not like we really, really focused on that. It wasn't like you were like, oh, well, here was your horoscope, and now let's talk about like this. It was more like you getting to know me better, but you had some insight because we really didn't even talk about the adaptotype yet, and we've spoken a few times. Um, but I think so this is kind of what I perceive as a framework with which you work, knowing this kind of about somebody as you're going in. It's almost like your questionnaire, like when you first start working with a client and you ask them a bunch of like interview questions. This seems to be maybe your way of understanding that person before they even understand themselves.
Yeah. And it's funny too because but I've been proven wrong. So let me just say this. I have, because of course I know these really well, these six adaptive types now.
Yeah.
And so I have a few colleagues that when I was testing this out, I was like, okay, I think I know you're going to be one of these two. And then they were like something completely different.
Mm,
And for me, it was such an insight into their priorities of, again, how are they keeping themselves safe from overwhelm? Like, really, what we're talking about is, and you and I've talked about this, how are they keeping them safe against specific risks,
hmm
right? Because when we're really working hard to keep those risks at bay, it's usually because there's been an overwhelming circumstance that has happened around it. Right? We've got a really good reason why we have that relationship with that risk.
hmm
And so when we're talking about overwhelm, we're also talking about risk, right? How can we start to have healthy relationships with both of these things? Um, but yeah, when it comes to the strategist, and I remember you and I started talking about it. Yes, it gave me a real sense of maybe how, for example, you related to goals, right? Possibly. And I always say, like, take what fits and leave the rest behind, right?
hmm
This is not the truth, but there might be something true here for you,
Right, right.
right? And so, yeah, this whole idea of like your business as a way of as a means of achieving your goals, for example, right? It's a really great vehicle for one's goals. The strategist is also really effective, like just get it done people, right? More than almost any of the other adaptive types, they have their plate full. They have a really, really high bandwidth for managing a lot of projects all at once. And also the overwhelm that comes from it, as well as the deadlines, as well as the people, like all of these things, right?
Yeah.
So the thing with strategists is that they tend to all like just add more and more and more because they think that they can handle it. But then they crash once that bandwidth limit is finally reached, right? And it's almost like a surprise when it happens. They're like, but I'm so good at this stuff. Like, how did I get here? This is
hmm
not who I am. It's very much like a not me quality. So the support for strategists sometimes can be around creating and holding boundaries, both with themselves as far as what they're committing to with themselves, right? As well as others, right?
hmm
Taking on maybe not as much. Also, maybe a loss of control, right, might be a really helpful thing, right? How can we like change the relationship with control, right? Or being really frustrated when other people don't own up to their end of an agreement. That's also something that really comes up for a strategist a lot,
hmm
like extremely so. So it's this idea of like, how can we soften around these things? Because what generally happens is that we have more options if we're able to get into different relationships with it, with a few of these different things. And suddenly it's like quite not so binary anymore. Like I do this
hmm
and this happens and that doesn't feel good. I do this and this happens and that doesn't feel good. Like, oh, it turns out we actually have all of these other possibilities here that we can lean into. And that's
hmm
generally what happens as we work through these things. We sort of shake the tree and things come out and they start to feel a little bit more aligned for ourselves.
Yeah. And then so is like, as you work with people, because again, we've only seen each other a few times, but as you work with people, you have a nice format in your sessions for like really trying to get at what's underneath, and and, and how to have like a different relationship with whatever it is and, different things that you can do that are not what you would have normally done, right? To try to
Sure.
make it more, I guess, like healthy or get yourself through it in a way that's more manageable, but it goes against your normal style of relating. So, like, what do you find that, on the other side of these, like going through coaching, like ultimately, what are you trying to help people do for
Great
themselves?
question. Yeah. My goal as a coach is to have my clients be in a, like a really healthy relationship with some of these risks that for them is a no-go,
Hmm.
right? So for me, for example, when I was first starting, I was talking about being visible. Visibility for me was a huge risk, right? Because it encapsulated judgment, it encapsulated just, that sense of belonging, right? Like
Hmm.
that would be at risk if I was really visible. So it sort of triggers these deeper things, right? And so my goal as a coach is really to like expand your self-concept a little bit to actually include more of those risks that you're keeping at an arm's length,
Hmm. Yeah.
right? And tap into those inner, like healthy inner resources that we all have in order to do that, right? And so, what the truth is that we usually find is that the risk that we're usually so working so hard against having in our lives, we're usually actually like living in it, but we don't realize it, right? Almost 100% of the time. Like, but it's usually internalized in some way,
Hmm.
right? So for me, for example, I was never, ever, ever going to be as front facing as I needed to be in the beginning of my coaching and entrepreneurial journey, and be really visible, but because that judgment was so intense. But the judgment that I had for myself was even more intense,
Hmm.
right? So I was actually already living with that risk. And it's true for most of us when it comes to these specific risks that we have really tricky relationships with.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about all the people like myself, all of the people that I've worked with in sessions, and just people that I've consulted with who are going through this process of like leaving something really secure and moving to something that's a little less secure. And I think about it in terms of like, you have to put yourself out there. You have to put yourself out there a whole bunch of times without knowing that you're not going to get a return on every time you put yourself out there. So you have to like do, for every like 20 conversations you have, you might get one that actually turns into something, right? And having like we're not used to doing that. We work in this system where people just come to us and we don't have any of that kind of like rejection or where people don't respond to you for whatever reason, right? Like we're used to being and we're also used to we're also used to not having to um work for credibility either,
Mm.
right? Like we are the person in our schools who do that. And then when we're on our own, like how are people going to just, but like you're saying, it kind of is like, how do you deal with that within yourself? Because, like for me, I mean,
Yeah.
here's an example. Like I have to be on social media, like, and I'm just like, oh my God, like I can't, I barely have, like, what are people going to think if I don't respond? I'm barely on it, so like when I do respond, like, are they going to think, what if I wait a day or do I have to, do a video or even if I do a video or like people are going to even see it? Is Facebook even going to show it in someone's algorithm? What am I even doing this for? But then I like make myself because I'm like, well, I like have to, but it's hard like as you're doing things, whether it's, in social media or just in your business, networking with people, or just even feeling like, oh, I can do this in a setting that's different where I don't have the backing of a system and it's just me. I mean, there's a lot that comes up there.
So much, and I totally get all of those things. And I think if you're an entrepreneur, you've arm wrestled with all of that. Where I've personally gotten to with it is like making sure the side of my street is clean. Like, does this feel clean for
Hmm.
me? Right. And so what I mean by that is like, is it about like acceptability, for example? Like, am I doing this because I feel like I have to, or else I won't be acceptable? One of the things I always say to my clients is there's nothing you can do in this session that will make you unacceptable. And because I think that that's a really important message. And it's one that I say because I'm also saying it to myself on a fairly regular basis, right? Because we all struggle with this, right? Like, is it okay that I'm not replying right away? In other words, is it okay that I have boundaries with my clients, right? That I have hours where I reply to emails and hours that I don't reply to emails or that I'm not replying to a Facebook message right away, right?
Hmm.
Um, these are things that we come to our own places of like how like am I acceptable to do this, right? And so For me, it's that's so much of the journey is getting to that place where you feel like there's that sense of belonging in what you do,
Yeah.
right? Where that sense of self-worth is intrinsic, where it's fine and people may have opinions and other people might be upset. It's rarely happened to me, which is really great evidence for me that it really didn't matter.
Yeah.
This thing
Yeah.
that I was like working so hard for, like it really didn't matter. Like I did the videos, right? I go online, I do all the things, right? And sometimes you're right, like the algorithm just isn't going to deliver it in the way that I want, right? Uh, I'm going out there and I'm making and I'm meeting people and say, hey, let's have a conversation. And but one of the things that I've settled into when it comes to client creation as well is that it really is truly an invitation, right? If you invite somebody to your party and it's a good friend of yours, right? But you really only want them to come if they want to come. Are you really going to be upset if they don't come? You wish they were there, but like you're not upset. That's a true invitation. Like you're willing to take no, right? And so my invitations to clients to work together is always that. It's always
Mhm.
like, you say no, it's absolutely, again, it's absolutely acceptable, right?
Yeah.
I trust them that they know what they need. And this
Yeah.
is just not what they need right now, or maybe it is, right? And that's really the place that I come from.
Hmm. I love that phrase too, because it makes me think of how we want kids and families to feel when they come to us in our profession, like that nothing you can do when you come into this room is unacceptable. I mean, that is like, gosh, if every teacher made every kid feel like that when they walked into their classroom,
Wow. Yeah.
that was
Yeah.
really powerful. That's like one of the Scottisms I'd like to write down.
Please, let's all take it. And you know, and it's we were all standing on the shoulders of giants, right? So
Yeah.
yeah,
I'm like literally writing it down. Um, yeah, my other one that I have next to me still is it's safe for me to offer myself some grace.
some grace.
It's safe for me to offer myself some grace.
Love that.
Yep.
Love that. How has that been for you,
It's
looking
been
at that message?
it's been helpful,
Yeah,
because like when, I my offices were full the other day and I knew that they were going to be full, which was an amazing thing, right? Like I was being kicked out of my office because there were 5 offices being used at the same time. And
like great
so,
problem to have, right?
yeah,
Like
it
so
was a
happy. Yeah,
win.
yeah,
Yeah, like
yeah.
that
Love
rarely
that.
happens. It was a win. And so I said to my admin, like, you take my office and I am going to work from home because I worked all last weekend in the office. So really haven't, like, I could take a day outside of the office, right?
Totally.
And so I said to her, because it's safe for me to offer myself some grace. And she was like, that is great. She's like, yes, you could be home. Like, we all know you're still working, like there, I just had like this judgment on myself, like,
Yeah,
I better show up, if people can't see me, it means I'm
yeah.
not here, or, you
Doesn't
know,
really count, right?
right, right,
Yeah, yeah,
right.
yeah. Totally get that. Totally get. And I think for those of us who worked in the corporate space in some way or in an office in some way, that really is hammered in really deep, right?
Yeah,
Especially during those formative like 20 something years, right? When you're in
yeah.
your 20s. Um, and and it's funny because I think one of the ways that I see that showing up for a lot of people is just sort of like sitting down at their computer but not knowing what they're doing, right? And but they're sort of trained to sit down and just like stare at the computer and they don't really have a plan and they're sort of going in all directions and they're not really focused. And I think a lot of that has to do with, again, it's sort of like, are you leading yourself? Like, what does your actual like self leadership look like in that moment?
Hmm.
Right? Like, what is the vision that you have for yourself? When we're in the corporate space and we're in surrounded by other desks and other people, we've got other eyes on us, and we're defined by those eyes,
Hmm.
by the gazes of others, right? And we've got this title, and people respond to it, and they know who we are, and we sort of know the shape of who we are and how we fit into that space as well. And it's because of everybody else, not even because of us,
Yeah.
right? So it's like once we leave that space, it's like, how do we, what's our shape? Like we
Yeah.
don't have
Well,
anybody reflecting it back to us. So we're like, we have to
yeah.
define that for ourselves. And that can be really tough.
Yeah. And we know that we do judge if like somebody isn't showing up or pulling their weight or where are they like and they start to get questionable, like that's you do judge, or I do. I mean, I have definitely
Mhm.
judged people before by their ability to not show up when needed, like, but I think, so, but then I like take that on as if people are going to be looking at me, but I know that I am not also like showing that I'm doing nothing in all the other ways that I'm doing everything, right?
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think, one of the things for me, um, in during COVID, and I think a lot of people felt like this, education was one of the only places that made everybody come back to work full time all at once.
All at once. Yeah. So
And
like couldn't have happened more quickly, right?
it was, at the time I was like an administrator in a school district. And so my entire job pretty much was just in meetings. And, we all had to just come back, because everybody had to come back. So they were like, you know, all for one, one for all, whatever it is. Like if one person's
Yeah.
coming back, everybody's coming back, you know,
Hmm.
from the
The idea of
custodian
fairness,
to
right? Yeah.
the teacher to the gardener to, to the administrators, like everybody's coming back full time. And it just felt very like childish. It felt like
Mhm.
we were in a system that was like, if you're at a workshop, you're at a workshop for 3 days, or like you're at a training for 3 days, you're going to come and sit at your desk and do it, you know? So
Yeah.
you weren't really there in you were here where people could bug you and you had to have your headphones in all day. Or here I am in meetings with six people around me with a mask on in
Mhm.
confidential meetings in a cubicle with like people in
Yeah.
the room. It just didn't make any sense. And I think a lot of people started feeling like that. I'm kind of on a tangent now, but like the point was, you know,
Not at all. I just totally vibe. Yeah, I'm totally getting this. This is okay, keep going.
and
Sorry.
it was a real reason why for me, I was just over it. I was like, I need to be doing something where I can live my purpose and feel like not so confined or constrained or made to feel like I was just like another number in a system. And I think really that it was kind of the impetus for a lot of people in education feeling like maybe this isn't being run in the way that it should, but it also like made me I knew in myself that no matter if I were sitting there in that desk or sitting at home, I was going to be working my butt off the whole time,
Yeah.
unless I took a walk around the block. Right. But I think we were all a little healthier at that point too, in terms of our mental health and our physical health, when we got to be a little bit more flexible with our time, and I just felt like disrespected in that sense. Right. Like I know
Yeah.
that I'm going to be doing this. So, kind of like you're saying, like, I already know that I'm doing that, but then when I put myself in another situation where people could be judging that in me, um, I need to feel like I need to show up. And if I'm not like here in
Yeah.
person, then what will people think of me? So it is
Right.
like ingrained.
It's ingrained that sort of that implied risk of judgment, right? Judgment as a
Right.
risk. Yeah. Yeah,
Right.
absolutely. And like I love what you're saying too, because Um, what I'm hearing is like there is this sort of infantilizing quality of what you're describing, right? But I think also what you're describing is this sense of predictability, fairness, right? But also like when it's veering from predictability, that's when that discomfort hits,
Mm,
right? When we get into unpredictable moments and the discomfort, how it shows up is it shows up in our bodies.
hmm
It shows up as a physical threat. It shows up in our necks sort of get tight, right? Our chest, we feel the pressure, right? Maybe our head gets sort of hot, our vision starts to limit itself, right? We sort
Yeah.
of lose our peripheral vision, right? And so it's so funny, these little moments of well, this is not entirely predictable, right? This person is not following the rules. Suddenly it becomes a physical discomfort
Mm.
for others. And instead of doing the work around that, right, we react to ourselves and others' reported physical discomfort instead of actually talking about it, right? So great, you're uncomfortable. That's not a reason, but like, what does that mean, right? Can we have a conversation around that? The work is for you, right? Instead of like having squeaky wheel policies where we just react to other people being uncomfortable,
Hmm.
maybe it's the policy needs to start being more like, great, maybe that person needs to have a conversation on what's actually happening for them underneath, right?
Yeah.
What is the risk that they're actually responding to physically in their body, but they don't even know it because it's like pre-verbal almost,
Hmm.
you know? So I love you talking about this because like this goes right back to that idea of like comfort and overwhelm,
Hmm.
and how we move between these two different areas. We talked about sameness and difference, right? It's very similar, sort of lives in that space.
So, as our audience are maybe people thinking about using their skills outside of this very comfortable system. Um, I know that risk and uncertainty are are big players here. There's a lot of question like, am I going to be able to make as much money if I leave the schools than if I stay? Am I going, like, am I going to be successful if I leave? Do I have the skills that I need in order to do that? Can I, do I have the confidence to put myself out there? Like, there's a lot of like this back and forth. What are some maybe tips for people as they're trying to think about this for themselves?
I love that question. What I would say is that every single one of those concerns has a right to be there. I think that we can sometimes have these concerns, then have a like an inner blowback against them, right? Like I shouldn't feel this way. I shouldn't be concerned around this. Like somebody who's really confident wouldn't think about it in this way. Um, what I would say is that they're all really valid. And a couple of things. One is that you're going to have to include the risk in what you do,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you're worried about not making enough money or as much money as you are now. Yeah, it makes sense, right? This is when you get into that golden handcuff sort of situation that
Yep.
many of us
Yep.
have found ourselves in, right? The benefits are too great for me to leave. Um, you actually have to include that risk. Like that might be true, right? Like financial sort of not failure, but just sort of like a tension
Yeah.
might be a part of what you do. And that's just going to be, again, something like how can you work with that? Like, how can you actually bring out some of those inner resources to help guide you through that difficult period, right? Where you're ramping up, maybe, right? It goes
Mm-hmm.
back to this period of like this idea of like, I can count on myself for what can you count on yourself for? Like, I know I can figure this out, and if I can't, here's my backup systems.
Mm-hmm.
This is how much I need to save. These are my options that I have, right? But if we're at the effect of the fear and of the risk, then we're actually not tapping into those healthy inner resources that give us those answers, that give us those options. We're
Mm-hmm.
only in the risk and we're only about avoiding the risk, right?
Mm-hmm.
So my thing is like include that as part of your process. Um, I always say like, what are your options? What do you need to tell yourself right now? Right? If you're like, put your hand on your heart, like, what do you need to hear right now? Give that to yourself. I think we outsource a lot to other people. We outsource like what we want to hear to our spouses, to our business partners, to our colleagues, to our friends. Um, and this is not to say that we should only be self-sufficient for these messages, right? Because it's nice to, part of a healthy relationship is getting those. But I think we also need to be able to know what is it exactly that I need to hear from myself right now and be able to provide that to yourself instead of leaning on those outside circumstances for them. Um, and ask for support. You don't need to do this on your own. This is not like you're not an unsuccessful entrepreneur if, for example, like you've got a runway that's a little bit longer than somebody else's, right? And includes some other support structures. Like that's just the story of how you get there. And I
Mm-hmm.
think we need to sort of give up this ideal story of entrepreneurship. I think it does way more damage than almost anything else. It's like just know that your path is not going to look like anybody else's.
Right.
It's only going to look like yours. And just lean into that. Again, it's like that acceptability. Like it's absolutely acceptable that it looks different than everybody else's. There's
Mhm.
nothing's gone wrong here.
Oh, it's so hard, but that's so good. Yeah. I mean, it's not easy. Like it's hard. Being kind of in the space that I'm in where I'm like trying to help people make this shift. And it is so exciting and amazing. And I, my goal is to inspire, right? Like I want to inspire and lift people up and make people feel like they can do it, right? Like I was a personal trainer for a long time on the side. I've always been like a aerobics instructor. Like I've always been like the kind of like, you can do this, like you got like person. And at the same time, it is really hard to do. It is not easy. And so I am constantly like trying to um, grow within myself. I'm reaching out for help from other people because it is really like I'm trying to find this balance between like, yes, it's amazing. And also, like, you better buckle up. Like
Buckle up,
it's
Buttercup. Yeah.
yeah, it's sometimes hard to I'm like, God, am I scaring people, into doing this? But yet I think that, my goal is to try like right now I'm in this program where I'm trying to like really help people lay some solid business foundations so that they feel like they have some solid footing to then like build upon, and we're starting there. And sometimes I'm like, gosh, this all seems kind of like doom and gloom, but really it's just like very serious. Like you start a business, it's not like a not serious thing, it's actually quite serious. So I'm it's I love like just hearing you talk about that, because you're really talking about like finding the resources within yourself, also reaching out for other people and for support, and knowing that your path is not going to be everybody else's path, yet we can um we can feel out different things in our environments and also look within ourselves and also deal with some of the beliefs that we have within ourselves to shift and change those so that you have a healthier relationship with the actual real things that are happening as you are an entrepreneur. Like they are happening. So it's how you deal with them and incorporate them into your life that are either going to make you have like an early heart attack or or thrive and flourish, right? Um,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. I think it's so funny. I think that one of the things I think we hear as entrepreneurs a lot is this idea of like living outside of our comfort zone, which
Mm-hmm.
I think we're sort of talking about that right now. And I I think there's a lot that people get wrong around that concept, right? And so this is just my inner rebel sort of coming
Yeah,
out.
I want to hear
I
it.
think for me, it's like very oversimplifying. It's very dismissing of your lived experience. It's like it's sort of asking you to brush past your lived experience
Right.
around like the things that have happened to you that you have a really damn good reason for having the reaction that you're having
Mm-hmm.
around, getting outside of that comfort zone. Like there's a reason why we have it, right?
Right.
Um, however, um, I do think that discomfort often goes hand in hand with meaningful activities and behaviors that allow us to grow and expand.
Mm-hmm.
So it's this real sort of tension between I want to push past this. I know that growth and expansion for myself as an entrepreneur and as a business leader is on the other side of it, but my comfort zone is there for a really good reason,
Mm.
right? And so it's like, how do you navigate that? And that really, in my experience, that's the work of being an entrepreneur,
Yep. And
right?
that's also the
It's like,
work you do
how do
in
you push
coaching.
past that? Correct. Just so happens. Yeah, no, but
Yeah.
but I do think that. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And no, I
exactly.
totally understand, because that is exactly what we have done in the couple of sessions that I've had with you, is like really try to get at what is underneath that, because there is something
Yeah.
there. It's there for a reason.
Mhm.
And you have to really get in touch with what that is so that you can figure out different ways to work with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly, exactly. But in a way that feels like it's right sized for you,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's never about doing something that is so big that protect inner protective element that is keeping us from those risks, that part of us that is just going to throw up every single story into our minds, right? That this is a really bad idea and here's why. Because this is
Mm-hmm.
what always happens when we do this, and this is what always happens. Some, whatever that thing is, it's like how can we actually right size next moves so that way we're just getting a little bit more evidence of like what we can do. And then we're
Mm-hmm.
building that out and slowly and but surely you're like off to the races and you're trying new things and you're like, oh my God, I never would have thought I would have been here before.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I have loved this conversation, just like I have loved all of our previous conversations. And I really appreciate you, yeah, being on the show and like
Likewise.
talking about all of this. Um, if people, so like just give us a little taste of like kind of how you work, what uh do you do like individual sessions? Do you do groups? Like what's your work style and how do people find you or get more information about working with
Sure. Yeah, thank you. So my website is scottrobson.net. Really easy to find. Robson is my last name, Robson. And how I work is both one-on-one. I also work within groups. I have a couple of different group programs that I work within. I also am a facilitator and a trainer. I work in a program that actually trains people to become coaches as well.
you?
And I facilitate groups. I've facilitated masterminds. Right now, I'm just focusing on my group programs at the moment. And I'm working on a new one, which I'm really excited about. But primarily right now it's one-on-one because I'm in between group programs, but those will be coming back online probably in the next couple months. I tend to do them a couple times a year.
Nice, nice. And
Yeah.
if people want to go take that adaptive type quiz, do they just go to your website?
Just go right to the website. Yep, you're going to see it right at the top, and
Okay.
you'll go ahead, press the button, and you'll go ahead and be able to take that adaptive type quiz. You'll get your results, and then you'll also get some additional things that you can do in your email. Some like three different ways that you can maybe self-coach a little bit, but
Mm-hmm.
sort of again like in a safe way, sort of push against what growth for you might look like, and that's just to continue to support you as you explore your adaptive type.
Yeah. And one last thing that I forgot to mention is that I really like your term growth edges.
Oh,
Because,
thanks.
yeah, I like that because it is like we're always as psychologists thinking like, well, what are your areas of strength? And then what are your like construction zones or areas for growth? Or, we don't like to really say weaknesses anymore, but we're kind of like, how do we say that in a positive way? Like these are areas that we're working on or we haven't gotten there yet, right? We really like that growth mindset language. And so growth edges, like, it just reminds me of like a piece of paper that's like curling up and like kind of like pulling up, like it's going somewhere, or it's like it's on fire and it's like sizzling in to the middle of the paper, but like either way, it's like making progress. And I just, yeah, I get those
Yeah.
visuals. So I love that.
I love that so much because because when I think of growth edges too, it's always like, and when I think I love the visuals that you have for it because it always, just even the term growth edge, it's presuming that there's a really healthy, wise part of you that knows where your growth is
Mm-hmm.
and is pointing your attention towards it. Even if you're not ready to do the work yet, you're like, I know that's a growth edge. In other words, I know that's an area that I'm investing like a next step in to see where I can go with it. And I know that's like sort of maybe the next step for me as far as like the next level. And maybe it's like having those tough conversations, setting those boundaries, holding yourself accountable, you know, doing more, doing less, right?
Yeah.
However that it comes up for you. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. But it
Mm-hmm.
always presupposes that there's a really healthy part of you that is leading you. And I really love
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and for parents to think about their kids like that, and for us to describe to kids like what we're trying to do with the work that we're doing with them to help them find, like that place, like that's really kind of the goal of our work. So,
Yeah.
Thanks
Oh, I'm so glad
thanks
that
for
resonated.
so much terminology that I just love
You're so
from you. So
welcome. You're
thank
so
you.
welcome.
Well, Scott Robson, thank you so much for this conversation and for being on the Empower LEP podcast. And yeah, I'm sure I'll talk to you again soon.
All right. Thanks so much, Jana.
Thank you for listening to the Empower LEP podcast. Episodes can be found at empowerlep.com. If you liked what you heard, please leave a 5-star rating and review on your favorite podcast player. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, or if you have any questions for me, don't hesitate to connect. I would love to learn more. I can be found at jana@empowerlep.com.